Hi, thank you again. This was really fantastic. I'm wondering, so I had a faculty member a decade or more ago when I was in school who was sort of the token black person on campus in a largely white campus. And she was also a lesbian, and she found herself the token person of other getting asked to be on panels for things. And she and I talked a lot about that. And so I wondered if, here we are 10, 15 years later, if that's still an experience that you have, that while on one hand you're, I don't want to say glorified, but placed as like, oh yeah, you're gonna have this opportunity to have a voice, and at the same time, as a token member, and I think you commented you were the only tenure track on campus. Just if you could speak a little bit to your experience on that, and if you see a way of moving beyond that.
Yeah, I'll start, and then it definitely happens. It's definitely a very real effect, and something that's my understanding. There's a lot of academic publishing out there actually directly on this issue, which is still very much an issue. Like I was saying earlier on, my expertise, my field, what I really want to spend my natural environment, as I called it, is being in a laboratory studying nuclear physics, building big machines, working with accelerators and detectors. A lot of the work that I've done within the LGBT issues within physics has largely been done because if I didn't have the communities that I've built up, I wouldn't still be in physics. And I'm at the point now where I am a tenure track faculty member. There are many, many young people out there who, they see me as the possibility for them as a role model, which is something that I didn't really have when I was kind of coming up through. So I know personally, just for trying to make things better for the next generation, to make things suck less, essentially, is a large part of why I've done what I do and feel internal pressure to do that. When at the same time, there's kind of external pressure from folks who are like, oh, well, you're now the expert on this. I became the expert on LGBT people in physics while I was a third-year graduate student on a completely unrelated topic. The person who told me that was trying to be kind and oh, look, you are the world expert on this. And the way I heard that is, this is a really, really sad state of affairs if a third-year graduate student not at all studying this is the world expert on it. So yeah, it's definitely an issue that continues to exist.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think about your question. I think that, the straightforward yes or no answer is yes, and it's part of what I was trying to talk about with the, unacknowledged work that people of marginalized identities tend to do in various settings. And I guess I wanted to say one thing that I kind of heard in what you were saying in your question was that you were in some ways being a presence there for that colleague to, to feel supported and feel heard and acknowledged. And that's human decency on one level, and on the other level, it's really critical, and something that I think gets really underemphasized sometimes too, is that simply, it's very easy when you are the queer person seeing discrimination, or when you're the person being called upon repeatedly to do these bonus-free diversity tasks or whatever, to feel a little like you're just imagining it, and so having other people listen to your experiences, believe you, hear, validate, and support in ways that you can. Obviously, you can't step in as the token black woman in that setting or anything, but when there are opportunities to speak up about an issue that you know that you're sort of well-versed on and that you've listened to people within that community, doing so and then checking in and having feedback and making sure that you're doing so in a respectful way, that can be one of the ways to kind of relieve some of that pressure. And then in general, trying to make it in your institution so that that person is not the only person in those particular identities or positions. And there are tons of great different ways that you can look into that would help with that too.
thought it was interesting in your data that you showed that there were more observations of discrimination than people individually feeling it, and that seemed across the board for your data. Do you think that's because we don't recognize discrimination towards ourselves, or we downplay it, or do you think it's just because there's more opportunity to see it among, that there's, I just found that a curious trend in all of your data.
Yeah, it's a really interesting data point, and I do want to reiterate again that people who observed harassment of other people were as likely, if not slightly more likely, to want to leave their institution than people who directly experienced it. As to the why of that, I cannot directly say because this is kind of the only data that we have on it right now. From personal experience, what I think might be part of the case is that it's a lot easier for me often to fight when I see somebody else experiencing things than when I myself am going through it. And I think that's kind of across the board for a lot of different marginalized identities for a variety of reasons. Big one just kind of being growing up and living and protecting yourself over the years and what that looks like. So I definitely think that those aspects are part of it, but I don't have the answer for why it is. All we can point to is that it's not just people experiencing it, but people seeing it happen to others is affecting them as much, if not more, than directly experiencing it ourselves.
I'm curious about how your professional colleagues support might be the wrong term because I don't think of colleagues supporting each other necessarily, but do you see any change or improvement in how fellow faculty or other professional staff not thinking of the right way to express it, but do you find any support from the professional colleagues on campus or in your profession in general? Or do you find this is a very isolating experience? Is there a network either on your campus or in your profession that allows you to feel supported and heard?
First or second?
So I would say it's a very mixed bag in my field in particular. There are certain strong trends toward that, neutrality, if we ignore stuff, it will go away kind of mentality. There are, in fact, branches that are the women just aren't as interested in CS, so why are we spending so many resources on trying to get them in? All of the, the range of things. And there are people who are very, passionate and supportive about inclusion and sort of personally supportive and things like this on the broader range in my field. And I think sort of along similar lines to what Els said, I'm sorry, Dr. Long said, that, buddies, that, to some extent, the work is, energizing and rewarding, but to another extent, I have to do it. I can't keep going if I'm not doing something about it. But there's definitely, pushback and things like that. There was another component of your question I was going to answer, but I'm going to... Yeah, so I was going to say actually, so I was a graduate student here at UNH and now I'm faculty here, and I will say that I felt a lot more supported and like there were clearer resources and networks available as a student by far. There are organizations on campus that I absolutely relied on as a student and that just aren't really structured toward faculty getting the same level and kind of support. So that is definitely an aspect to, to keep in mind. And when you hear about efforts along the lines of, groups to support people who are underrepresented in your field, or other resources or policies or anything like that. I definitely have felt like making that switch between student and faculty meant losing a lot of the supports and the resources that were available.
I didn't show this on my slides, but if you look up the report, we actually have some data on how LGBT physicists were able to find resources or not, as the case may be. And that also varied dependent on their identity as well. I know for myself, kind of getting started, I mentioned the story of my first conference, kind of asking where are the resources. When I kind of first started on this kind of path that led me to doing a lot of the work that I showed earlier, it was very, very lonely, very isolating work, especially within physics. And part of what I think the issue is in physics is actually related, I think, to part of what you were talking about with the issue of this kind of big black box, but it's humans thinking of themselves as a big black box, where they take information in, they think they handle it in an unbiased manner, and then spit out a result. And physicists are really, really good at convincing ourselves that we're unbiased. In particular, and our demographics do not reflect that at all. It has a couple of just kind of examples of some of the issues that, other things I got faced when I first started asking these questions of, I started facing things and started talking with my, straight cis colleagues at the National Lab, because there was me as the only out LGBT person, let alone the only trans person at that laboratory. And talking with colleagues, they would tell me things like, oh no, that's not an issue. Like if that was an issue, I would have heard of it. And then as we started kind of going through, I spent almost a decade every single year at conferences asking the APS's research group to just have a question, are you LGBT, on their database that they use to get the number of women PhDs, people of color PhDs, all these different sets of data that we had for certain marginalized groups did not exist at all for LGBT people. And the response I got year after year after year after year for about a decade, again, starting around 2008-ish, was, we can't ask that, it's too controversial. So we got stuck in physics in this kind of self-repeating cycle that there was no data to show that there was an issue. We would experience the issue, talk about the fact we were experiencing the issue to our colleagues who themselves weren't LGBT, who would then tell us there was no data on the issue, that we couldn't actually get data on the issue, and there was just kind of this big cycle back and forth that we spent a long, long time trying to break out of. And that's a huge part of why we did this report in the manner we did, is because I now have this 60, 70 page document that I can hit people over the head with, be like, no, it was real this whole time. Since that's come out, we have been seeing changes within physics itself. Those changes have largely come, part of what we were talking about earlier about this unacknowledged extra work, has come from LGBT people. I mean, we have some allies as well, but largely from LGBT people working together, organizing to create these resources because we're all kind of experiencing these things. Another resource that's out there on our LGBT plus physicist website, so a different one than on there now, but if you Google it, you'll find it, is we put together a best practices guide for physics and astronomy departments of things that individual departments can do on the short term, long term, and bigger term, from like really small, easy to change things to like really big institutional change things, of how you can make a more inclusive department for LGBT students and faculty members. And we've seen that kind of take off and blow up. We actually, this past year, there was a really big revision of that done, because a lot of things have changed in the time since we first put it out, and as things change again, we'll update it again. But that resource is out there as well, of different things that you can do in order to support your colleagues, particularly on the LGBT front, because that's what we've been working on.
Excellent. We have reached time. I want to thank you both so much for your wonderful and important talks. And just one more round of applause, please, for our speakers today.